What if everything you've ever known about the birth of Western philosophy isn't what it seems? What if the names we revere, Plato, Pythagoras, Thales, were not the creators of these ideas, but rather the recipients? What if the true origins of their wisdom lay not in Athens, nor in the heart of Greece, but along the banks of the Nile? Pause for a moment and consider this. If you follow the evidence, there's no turning back. The journey we're about to embark on may challenge everything you've ever believed. Before ancient Greece even produced a single philosopher, Egypt had already built a rich intellectual legacy. It was a civilization that outpaced its contemporaries, forging paths in mathematics, astronomy, ethics, and much more. This was not a mythic, mysterious civilization. It was a society rooted in practical knowledge, one that had been constructing the very foundation of thought for millennia, long before Greece emerged as a center of learning. The Egyptians had already established the pillars of wisdom that would later be claimed as Greek. In the heart of Egypt stood its temples, which were not just sanctuaries for divine worship. These were the Per Ankh, houses of life, where intellectual pursuits were intertwined with religious practice. Within these walls, Egyptian priests underwent rigorous training for decades. Their studies encompassed geometry, medicine, astronomy, and what we would now consider philosophy. These disciplines were not foreign to the Egyptians. They had been exploring the divine order of the universe, the nature of the soul, and the ethical implications of governance for thousands of years before Greek philosophers began their formal training. When Greek thinkers made their way to Egypt, they were not arriving as experts to share their knowledge. They came as students eager to learn from the ancient wisdom that Egypt had been cultivating for centuries. According to the historian Diodorus Siculus, a Greek himself, many of the most celebrated Greek philosophers spent significant time in Egypt, studying under the tutelage of Egyptian priests. He names these figures: Pythagoras, Plato, Democritus, and others, all of whom journeyed to Egypt in search of deeper knowledge. Diodorus' account doesn't describe them as mere visitors. They were students, humble learners, absorbing knowledge that they would later carry back to Greece and present as their own contributions to philosophy, often without acknowledging their Egyptian sources. Take a moment to reflect on that. Pythagoras, the man whose name is immortalized in the theorem that bears his name, was not a self-taught genius. Ancient sources, including the philosopher Emblaeus, tell us that Pythagoras spent over 2 decades in Egypt, learning from Egyptian priests. 22 years, more than the length of a typical life's work. This was not a brief trip. This was an immersion into the heart of Egyptian intellectual culture. Bleekus recounts that it was Thales of Miletus, another early Greek philosopher who had also studied in Egypt, who encouraged Pythagoras to seek out the priests of Memphis and Diospolis to tap into the unrivaled knowledge that had been passed down through the generations in Egypt. What then did Pythagoras learn in Egypt? The Egyptians already had advanced knowledge of mathematics, including the relationship between numbers and geometric principles. They were using precise ratios in their construction long before Pythagoras was born. The Pythagorean theorem, the fundamental concept of geometry, was known to the Egyptians and Babylonians centuries before the Greeks codified it. It was Pythagoras who systematized this understanding, taking the Egyptian knowledge, presenting it in a form that resonated with the Greek world and gaining recognition as the discoverer of the theorem. But let's be clear, the knowledge wasn't his creation. It had existed long before him. The Egyptian priests who shared this knowledge never received the acknowledgement they deserved. When it comes to Plato, the story is no different. Considered one of the greatest philosophers in Western history, Plato's theories on the nature of the soul, the ideal state, and the immortality of the mind are central to the foundation of Western thought. However, Plato did not emerge out of nowhere. According to the geographer Strauss, Plato spent over a decade in Egypt, where he was educated by the Egyptian priests. During these 13 years, Plato absorbed and internalized the wisdom of Egypt, which would later inform his dialogues and philosophical theories. Even the most distinctive aspects of Plato's thinking have roots in Egyptian thought, which predated him by thousands of years. One of the most striking similarities between Plato's philosophy and Egyptian thought is his theory of forms. The idea that the material world we see around us is just a shadow of a higher, more perfect reality. Plato argued that the philosopher's role was to transcend the illusion of the material world and seek the eternal truth which exists beyond what can be perceived through the senses. But this was not a new concept introduced by Plato. In Egyptian thought, the idea of a higher divine order that transcends the chaos of the physical world was already deeply embedded in their religious practices and intellectual life. The Egyptians had a concept known as Mahat, which referred to the cosmic principles of truth, justice, and balance. This idea of a higher unchanging order mirrored Plato's theory of forms. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, a sacred text that outlines the journey of the soul after death, echoes similar themes about the soul's journey toward truth and divine judgment. Even Plato's famous allegory of the cave, which describes how prisoners in a dark cave mistake shadows for reality until one of them escapes to see the light of truth, mirrors the teachings of the Egyptian mystery schools. The symbolism in Plato's work of breaking free from illusion and seeing the true light has clear precedence in Egyptian wisdom. The structure of Plato's allegory is not an invention of Greek thought. It is an Egyptian legacy reinterpreted. As we explore this untold history, it's important to start by understanding the context in which these Greek thinkers emerged. The ancient Greeks are celebrated for their philosophical achievements. But what if we reconsider the foundations of their intellectual achievements? Greece, often considered the birthplace of Western philosophy, was in reality a recipient of knowledge imported from Egypt, the land of profound intellectual legacy. This acknowledgement does not diminish the achievements of Greek thinkers. Instead, it adds a layer of nuance and depth, inviting a fuller understanding of how knowledge evolves. The Egyptians, long before their Greek counterparts, were already masters of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. They had been refining these disciplines for millennia. The civilization that gave birth to the pyramids also gave rise to an intricate understanding of the universe and human existence. Their intellectual pursuits were deeply intertwined with their spirituality. Egyptian philosophy was not just about abstract ideas. It was embedded in their everyday life, art, and governance. The ancient Egyptians saw the universe as a carefully ordered system, and they devoted themselves to understanding and embodying that order. As we shift focus to the Greek philosophers, it becomes clear that the narrative of Western intellectual history has often been simplified. Thinkers like Plato, Pythagoras, and Theos are lauded as the founders of modern thought. Yet, these individuals didn't arrive at their ideas in a vacuum. It's well documented that many of those philosophers traveled to Egypt to study, not as conquerors or independent thinkers, but as students eager to absorb the knowledge that had already been established by Egyptian scholars. Their time in Egypt, sometimes lasting years, was a transformative period that greatly influenced the development of their philosophies. These early Greek philosophers ventured to Egypt to access the wisdom housed in its temples, schools, and libraries, institutions that were centuries ahead of anything found in Greece. The Egyptian education system, steeped in mystery and spirituality, became the foundation for much of what the Greeks would later claim as their own intellectual achievements. Diodorus Siculus, the ancient Greek historian, provides valuable insight into this cultural exchange. He clearly states that many of the prominent Greek philosophers, including Pythagoras, Plato, and Thales, traveled to Egypt and spent extended periods of time there, learning from the Egyptian priests. This wasn't simply a tourist trip or a brief stopover. These were deliberate educational journeys, some lasting decades. The Greeks were students, and the Egyptians were their teachers. Yet when these ideas returned to Greece, they were often stripped of their Egyptian origins, presented instead as the groundbreaking work of Greek thinkers. This erasure of Egypt's influence on Western thought has been a significant oversight in the way history has been written. It is not just a matter of intellectual theft. It's a matter of cultural appropriation, where the contributions of one civilization are minimized or erased to allow another to claim ownership. Consider Pythagoras, for example. He's remembered for the Pythagorean theorem, one of the most famous equations in mathematics. But his journey to Egypt and the deep mathematical knowledge he acquired there is seldom acknowledged. Pythagoras did not invent these concepts. He learned them in Egypt, where the understanding of geometry and mathematics was already sophisticated. The ancient Egyptians had long known the relationships between numbers and geometry, especially in the construction of the pyramids. Pythagoras didn't bring these ideas to Greece. He brought them back in a way that would resonate with the Greek world, and he was credited as the originator. This pattern of appropriation wasn't unique to Pythagoras. Plato took substantial inspiration from Egyptian thought. His theory of the forms, which posits that the material world is merely a shadow of a higher, unchanging reality, mirrors Egyptian concepts like Mahat, an ancient idea of divine order and truth that existed long before Plato. The ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead speaks of the soul's journey toward an eternal truth, a journey that mirrors Plato's descriptions of the soul's ascent toward truth and wisdom. The allegory of the cave, one of Plato's most famous philosophical illustrations, in which prisoners are chained in a cave and mistake shadows for reality, can be directly traced back to Egyptian teachings. In Egyptian mystery schools, initiates move from darkness to light, just as Plato described the philosopher moving from ignorance to knowledge. The parallels between Greek and Egyptian thought are undeniable. Yet, they have been obscured for centuries. The Greeks were not the sole creators of the ideas that have shaped Western civilization. Rather, they were influenced by an earlier, richer intellectual tradition, one rooted in Egypt. This influence extended beyond philosophy and into other fields of study. Greek thinkers also borrowed extensively from Egyptian medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. The very concepts that underpinned Western civilization were not born in Greece. They were brought to Greece from Egypt, and as these ideas were absorbed, they were then repackaged and credited to Greek thinkers, leaving their Egyptian roots largely unacknowledged. This intellectual inheritance from Egypt has remained largely hidden, ignored, or downplayed, and its impact on the development of Western thought has only recently begun to receive the attention it deserves. The story of how the ancient Greeks borrowed from Egypt is not just about the theft of intellectual property. It is about the erasure of Africa's contribution to the development of Western civilization. The Egyptians, whose knowledge preceded the Greeks by millennia, have been relegated to the role of a backdrop in the history of intellectual development. While the Greeks have been placed at the center of this story, but the historical evidence is clear. The Greeks did not invent philosophy, mathematics, or science. They absorbed it. They were students, not originators. By acknowledging the profound influence of Egypt on Greece, we not only rectify a historical injustice, but also bring to light the true foundations of Western intellectual thought. As we delve deeper into this history, the importance of recognizing Egypt's contributions becomes even clearer. To understand the full impact of Egypt's intellectual legacy, we must look at the cultural and historical context of both civilizations. Egypt, as an ancient civilization, was at the heart of the Mediterranean world for thousands of years, long before the rise of Greece. Its influence extended far beyond the Nile Valley, reaching across Africa, Asia, and Europe. The intellectual traditions developed by the Egyptians were not isolated. They were part of a complex web of trade, migration, and cultural exchange that spanned the ancient world. Egypt was the epicenter of knowledge, and it was from here that many of the ideas that would later shape Western thought spread across the Mediterranean. Greek intellectuals, particularly in the early stages of Greek philosophy, were not working in a vacuum. They were exposed to ideas from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and other ancient cultures. The great philosophers of Greece may have been the ones to systematize and spread these ideas, but the foundation of their thinking was laid long before they stepped foot in Greece. This understanding forces us to reconsider how we view the origins of Western thought. For centuries, we have been taught to view Greece as the sole originator of philosophy, science, and mathematics. But this narrative ignores the contributions of Egypt, a civilization whose intellectual achievements predated those of Greece by millennia. To fully appreciate the scope of Egypt's influence, it's important to understand the educational system that nurtured some of the greatest minds of the ancient world. The Per Ankh, or House of Life, was the heart of Egyptian education. These institutions were not simply places of worship or spiritual learning. They were centers of intellectual activity, where knowledge was passed down through generations of priests. Here, students learned not just about religion and spirituality, but also about mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The priests who taught at these institutions were some of the most educated people in the ancient world, and their knowledge formed the basis of many of the concepts later adopted by Greek philosophers. It was in these houses of life that the foundational ideas about the universe, the soul, and human existence were formulated. These were not merely abstract concepts. They were practical, grounded in the everyday needs of the Egyptian people from agriculture to medicine. The intellectual climate in Greece, in contrast, was relatively young. By the time Greek philosophers like Pythagoras, Plato, and Theos began their studies, Egypt had already been developing its intellectual traditions for thousands of years. The Egyptians had an intimate understanding of the stars, the cycles of the moon, the movement of planets, and the mathematical relationships that governed the natural world. The Greek philosophers, when they arrived in Egypt, were exposed to this wealth of knowledge, but they did not merely absorb it passively. They adapted it to fit their own intellectual frameworks. This blending of Egyptian knowledge with Greek thought is what gave rise to the Western philosophical tradition. But the process was not a simple one. The Egyptians had a deep connection between their intellectual pursuits and their religious beliefs. For them, the study of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy was not separate from their understanding of the divine. The Greeks, on the other hand, tended to compartmentalize their intellectual endeavors, separating science from religion and philosophy from spirituality. This distinction between Egyptian and Greek intellectual traditions is crucial to understanding the cultural divide between the two civilizations. Greek philosophy, as it emerged in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, was characterized by a rational, analytical approach to understanding the world. Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were concerned with understanding the nature of reality, ethics, and human existence through reason and logic. While the Egyptians were deeply spiritual, their intellectual pursuits were intertwined with their religious and cosmological beliefs. Greek philosophy, by contrast, sought to separate the physical world from the spiritual realm, focusing instead on the rational explanation of the world around them. The tension between these two intellectual traditions is evident in the writings of the early Greek philosophers. Plato, for example, famously developed his theory of forms, which posited that the material world was a mere reflection of a higher, unchanging reality. This idea had clear roots in Egyptian thought, particularly the Egyptian concept of Mahat, which represented cosmic order, truth, and balance. But Plato's version of this idea was framed within the context of Greek philosophy, which emphasized logic and reason over religious or spiritual explanations. The Egyptian concept of Mahat, on the other hand, was deeply tied to the understanding of the divine, and it informed the way Egyptians saw the world and their place within it. The influence of Egypt on Greek philosophy is not just a matter of intellectual exchange. It also has cultural and political implications. By erasing the contributions of Egypt, Western scholarship has created a narrative in which Greece stands as the sole originator of Western thought. This narrative has been used to justify the idea of European superiority, a belief that has been central to Western colonialism and imperialism. By presenting Greece as the origin of all philosophical and intellectual achievements, Western civilization has been able to frame itself as the pinnacle of human progress, while marginalizing the contributions of Africa and other cultures. The erasure of Egypt's intellectual legacy is not a neutral historical oversight. It is part of a larger ideological project that has shaped how we view the history of civilization. This process of erasure has had far-reaching consequences. It has contributed to the marginalization of African intellectual traditions and reinforced the idea that Africa was a primitive, backward continent that had nothing to offer the development of human knowledge. The reality, as we have seen, is quite different. Egypt was not just a cradle of civilization, it was the source of many of the ideas that would later shape Western philosophy and science. The contributions of Egyptian thinkers should be recognized and celebrated, not only because of their intellectual achievements, but also because of the broader cultural and historical context in which they arose. Egypt's legacy is not just about the pyramids and the pharaohs. It is about the profound impact that Egyptian intellectual traditions have had on the development of human knowledge. As we continue to explore this history, we must ask ourselves, what would the world look like if we fully acknowledge Egypt's role in the birth of Western thought? What if we began to view the intellectual achievements of the Greeks not as isolated innovations, but as part of a larger, interconnected tradition of knowledge that stretched across Africa and the Mediterranean? What if we stopped erasing the contributions of Egypt and started telling the fuller, richer story of human intellectual history? These are the questions we must grapple with if we are to understand the true origins of Western philosophy and the ways in which African civilizations shaped the world as we know it today. As we turn our attention back to the sources of this erased history, it's essential to recognize that these questions are not merely academic. They are deeply tied to the way we understand our cultural heritage and the intellectual roots that shape our modern world. The absence of Egypt from the Western narrative is more than just a historical gap. It is a deliberate omission that has been sustained over centuries. This omission has profound implications not only for our understanding of ancient history, but also for how we view the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. The historical records are clear. Many of the early Greek philosophers studied in Egypt. This is not a matter of speculation. It is documented by Greek historians and philosophers themselves. The Greek writer Diodorus Siculus, for example, wrote extensively about the time Greek thinkers spent in Egypt, acknowledging that they were students, not teachers, when they arrived. This acknowledgement is critical, for it challenges the myth that Greek intellectual achievements emerged in isolation. It forces us to rethink the origins of Western philosophy as something that was born solely out of the Greek mind. And yet, despite the clear historical evidence, the dominant narrative continues to paint Greece as the sole origin of Western thought. We are taught that Greek philosophers like Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle were the innovators who shaped the intellectual landscape of the Western world. But what if these figures were not the originators of their ideas, but the inheritors of a much older tradition? What if they were simply the ones who systematized and packaged ideas that had been passed down through generations of Egyptian thinkers? The notion that Greek philosophers were not creators, but rather receivers and adapters of ancient Egyptian knowledge opens up a radically different view of intellectual history. To consider this, we must look at the intellectual traditions of Egypt in more depth. The Egyptians had a sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy long before the Greeks ever picked up a pen. The Egyptians had already calculated the movements of the stars, mapped the heavens, and understood the principles of geometry and mathematics long before Pythagoras famously formulated his theorem. The Egyptians had been practicing medicine and healing for centuries before Hippocrates was born. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts known to man, provides detailed descriptions of surgical procedures, diagnosis, and treatments, all based on careful observation and rational thought. The philosophical traditions of Egypt were similarly advanced. The Egyptian priests taught their students about Mahat, the divine concept of balance, order, and truth, which formed the basis of Egyptian law and morality. This concept of cosmic order and divine justice influenced not only Greek philosophy, but also later Judeo-Christian thought. Plato's theory of forms, in which he posited that the material world was an imperfect reflection of a higher, unchanging reality, has clear parallels with the Egyptian belief in a transcendent realm of truth and order represented by Mahat. However, as we explore the extent of Egypt's intellectual contributions, we encounter a major obstacle: the narrative that has been constructed around the development of Western philosophy. This narrative has been shaped by centuries of European scholarship that sought to distance the origins of Western thought from Africa. The idea that Greek civilization arose independently of Egypt was essential to the construction of a narrative of European superiority. This narrative portrayed Greece as the birthplace of reason and rationality, while Africa, and particularly Egypt, were relegated to the realms of mysticism and superstition. This ideological framework, which emerged during the Enlightenment and the rise of European colonialism, has had lasting effects on how we view history. It created a division between the so-called rational civilizations of Europe and the superstitious cultures of Africa in the East. In this framework, Egypt was relegated to the status of a mysterious ancient civilization with little intellectual merit, while Greece was portrayed as the true birthplace of Western civilization and the home of reason. This division not only distorts the historical record, but also perpetuates harmful stereotypes about Africa and its contributions to world history. The erasure of Egypt's intellectual legacy is not just a matter of historical oversight. It is part of a larger project to construct a narrative of European superiority. The idea that Greece was the sole origin of Western philosophy and science has been used to justify colonialism, racism, and the exploitation of African people and resources. By denying Egypt's role in shaping Western thought, European scholars created a story that reinforced their own political and cultural dominance. This narrative, however, has been increasingly challenged in recent years by scholars like George G.M. James and Martin Bernal, who have worked tirelessly to reclaim Egypt's place in the history of intellectual thought. James, in his influential book, Stolen Legacy, argues that Greek philosophy was largely derived from Egyptian thought. He suggests that the Egyptian priests were the true originators of the ideas later attributed to Greek philosophers, and that these ideas were transmitted to Greece through direct contact between the two civilizations. Bernal, in his groundbreaking work, Black Athena, goes even further, arguing that Greek civilization was deeply influenced by African and Semitic cultures, and that the systematic erasure of these influences was part of a broader ideological project to distance Europe from Africa and the East. The work of James and Bernal has been met with significant resistance, particularly from scholars who are invested in maintaining the traditional narrative of Greek intellectual superiority. However, the strength of their arguments and the weight of the historical evidence cannot be ignored. The ancient Greek writers themselves testify to the influence of Egypt on their thinking. Herodotus, for example, acknowledged the deep debt Greece owed to Egypt in terms of religion, mathematics, and science. The Greek historian Strabo also noted the extensive education that Greek philosophers received in Egypt, and he even went so far as to say that the Egyptians were the true founders of many of the ideas that would later be credited to Greece. This acknowledgement by ancient Greek writers is crucial because it reveals that the idea of Greek intellectual independence was a later invention. The Greeks themselves were not shy about recognizing the profound influence of Egypt on their thinking. They understood that their civilization was built upon the intellectual achievements of Egypt, just as modern Western civilization is built upon the intellectual achievements of both Greece and Egypt. By ignoring this fact, we perpetuate a myth that denies the true origins of Western philosophy and science. The absence of Egypt in the dominant narrative of Western thought is not only an academic oversight, but a deliberate distortion, one that has far-reaching consequences. By downplaying Egypt's contributions to philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, we perpetuate a historical amnesia that distances the present from its African roots. This erasure has been used to justify centuries of colonial exploitation, where European powers in need of a justification for their dominance argue that they were bringing civilization to a supposedly primitive Africa. In this narrative, the intellectual achievements of Africa were either ignored or dismissed as irrelevant to the development of Western civilization. This narrative did not just affect the way scholars studied ancient history, it shaped how African civilizations were perceived in the modern world. For centuries, Africa was portrayed as a continent devoid of intellectual achievement, with Egypt often reduced to the status of an ancient mystery, its intellectual and cultural contributions ignored or dismissed. This view became ingrained in Western thought, not just among academics, but among the general public, creating a legacy of racial stereotypes and misunderstandings that persist to this day. But this distortion of history is slowly being corrected. Scholars like James and Bernal, by returning to the historical records, are working to reclaim the lost legacy of Egypt and restore its rightful place in the history of Western philosophy. They argue that the time has come for reevaluation of our understanding of the intellectual foundations of the Western world, one that acknowledges the debt owed to Egypt and to Africa as a whole. In recent years, this debate has gained traction, not just in academic circles, but in popular culture as well. The idea that the origins of Western philosophy are deeply connected to Egypt and to Africa is gaining more acceptance. As people begin to challenge the long-held assumptions that have defined how we understand intellectual history, more and more scholars are exploring the ways in which ancient Egypt influenced Greek thought, and their findings are beginning to reshape how we view the intellectual history of the ancient world. This reevaluation is important not just for scholars, but for the broader public as well. By recognizing the true origins of Western philosophy and science, we can begin to understand how interconnected human knowledge truly is. We can see that the intellectual achievements of one civilization are not isolated, but build upon the knowledge of others. This perspective encourages a more inclusive and holistic view of history, one that recognizes the contributions of all peoples to the development of human knowledge. At the same time, this re-examination of history forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the way history has been written and about the role that colonialism has played in shaping our understanding of the past. The idea that Greece was the sole origin of Western thought has been used to justify the domination of non-European peoples, especially Africans. This idea has been used to perpetuate a narrative of European superiority, one that erased the contributions of African civilizations and relegated them to the margins of history. In recent decades, however, this narrative is being challenged. The works of scholars like James and Bernal, as well as the growing interest in the African roots of Western philosophy, are slowly changing the way we view history. This shift is not just a matter of academic interest. It is part of a broader movement to reclaim the intellectual contributions of African civilizations and to correct the historical record. It is a movement that seeks to acknowledge the debt that the Western world owes to Africa and to give credit where credit is due. The question now is how we can move forward. How can we incorporate the intellectual contributions of Africa and particularly Egypt into our understanding of history? How can we acknowledge the role that African civilizations played in shaping the intellectual traditions of the West? This is not just a matter of academic inquiry, but a question of cultural recognition and intellectual honesty. The answer lies in returning to the historical record and acknowledging the facts. We must recognize that Greece did not invent philosophy in a vacuum. Greek philosophers were deeply influenced by Egyptian thought, and their work was built upon the foundation laid by Egyptian priests and scholars. Pythagoras, Plato, Theos, and others may have systematized and spread the knowledge they learned in Egypt, but the ideas themselves were not their own. The true origins of Western philosophy lie not in Greece, but in Egypt, in the house of life, on the banks of the Nile. This acknowledgement is long overdue. It is time for the world to recognize the debt that Western civilization owes to Africa and to give Egypt the credit it deserves for its contributions to the intellectual traditions of the West. It is time to correct the historical record and to rewrite the story of Western thought, one that includes the full contributions of Africa from Egypt to the rest of the continent. As this revisionist history takes hold, the task of education becomes crucial. Schools, universities, and academic institutions must confront this reimagined narrative and rethink how they present the intellectual history of the world. For far too long, students have been taught that the history of Western philosophy, science, and mathematics began in Greece, as though these intellectual traditions sprang forth without influence or foundation. The time has come for this falsehood to be corrected. But this is not an attack on Greece, nor should it be viewed as a diminishment of Greek intellectual achievement. Instead, it is a recognition of the roots of that achievement, roots that extend deep into Africa, specifically into Egypt. This corrected narrative requires a shift in perspective. It requires a willingness to acknowledge the interconnectedness of human knowledge and to understand that civilizations influence each other across time and space. The achievements of the ancient Greeks should not be stripped of their significance, but they should be understood as part of a broader continuum of human thought that spans multiple cultures and regions. By understanding this, we can appreciate the contributions of each civilization to the greater tapestry of knowledge. This correction also demands an acknowledgement of the ongoing legacy of colonialism in shaping our understanding of history. The European Enlightenment, which sought to establish Europe as the center of the world, played a significant role in distorting the intellectual contributions of Africa. The narrative of Greek intellectual superiority was not simply the product of historical evolution. It was shaped by a deliberate effort to justify the domination of Africa and the subjugation of its peoples. This ideological shift in scholarship served to erase African contributions to knowledge and to position Europe as the intellectual birthplace of the modern world. But the evidence is there, hidden in plain sight, preserved by the very Greeks who learned from Egypt. The task of correcting this narrative is not only an academic one, it is a cultural one that will require a shift in how we view the past and how we teach the next generation about the true history of human thought. The impact of this correction is profound. By recognizing the true origins of Western philosophy and science, we can open new doors for the future. We can foster a more inclusive and holistic view of history that celebrates the contributions of all peoples, regardless of their geographic location or ethnic background. The cultural impact of this shift goes beyond the classroom. It influences how we view ourselves, our identities, and our relationships with others. It challenges the deeply entrenched ideas of racial superiority and intellectual hierarchy that have shaped modern society. It helps to break down the walls that divide us, allowing for a more inclusive understanding of what it means to be human and how we are all connected by our shared intellectual heritage. Moreover, this recognition of African contributions to philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and other fields can have a profound impact on the African diaspora today. It provides a source of pride and empowerment, reminding African-descended peoples across the globe of their intellectual heritage. It challenged the stereotype that African history is merely a story of suffering and exploitation, and highlights the rich intellectual and cultural traditions that have long been at the heart of African civilizations. As the story of Egypt's intellectual legacy begins to take its rightful place in the broader history of human knowledge, we are also reminded of the cyclical nature of history. What was once hidden or distorted is being brought into the light. And what was once ignored is now being recognized for its profound significance. The task of rewriting history is not just about correcting the past, but about reshaping our future. This is why the continued exploration of African intellectual history is so important. The contributions of Egypt to the development of Western thought are not just a matter of historical interest. They are a vital part of the ongoing story of human progress. The work of scholars like James Bernal and others continues to illuminate the hidden connections between Africa and the West, and their work is an important part of reclaiming African intellectual history for future generations. Their contributions will help ensure that the next generation of thinkers, scholars, and leaders are fully aware of the deep and enduring intellectual ties between Africa and the West, and that the contributions of African civilizations are given the credit they deserve. The work of reclaiming African intellectual history goes beyond just the academic world. It must also involve a broader cultural awakening. The recognition of Egypt's profound influence on the development of Western thought is not just about recognizing historical facts. It's about fostering a deeper understanding of the connections that unite us as a human family. By acknowledging the intellectual debt that the West owes to Africa, we are helping to dismantle the barriers that have kept knowledge divided along racial and cultural lines. This shift has the power to transform how we view not only the past, but also the present and the future. This transformation of historical narrative is not without resistance. Even as the evidence continues to mount, the traditional story of Western intellectual history, which places Greece at its center, remains entrenched in many educational systems, museums, and popular media. It is difficult to unlearn deeply ingrained ideas, especially when they have been reinforced for centuries. But as more scholars, educators, and activists work to reframe the story of knowledge and its origins, change is beginning to take hold. The conversation is shifting slowly but surely. Part of the challenge is confronting the political and cultural implications of rewriting this narrative. Acknowledging Africa's contributions to global intellectual history forces us to confront the legacy of colonialism and the ways in which European domination shaped not only the physical world, but also the intellectual one. For centuries, Western scholarship has excluded, overlooked, and distorted the contributions of non-European cultures. This intellectual exclusion was a tool of domination, reinforcing the notion that Europe was the source of all knowledge and civilization. The rediscovery of African contributions to philosophy, science, and medicine challenges this worldview. It forces us to recognize that intellectual progress is not the exclusive domain of one race or civilization, but a collective human achievement. As this new understanding spreads, it has the potential to transform not only academia, but also popular culture. It can influence how we view the development of ideas and the flow of knowledge across civilizations. For the first time, we can begin to tell a story of human progress that acknowledges the interconnectedness of all cultures and the diverse contributions that have shaped our world. This reimagined history is not just about correcting the past, but creating a more inclusive, accurate, and empowering future. It is important to note that this revisionist approach does not deny the value of Greek contributions to knowledge and philosophy. What it does is place those contributions in a proper context, one that recognizes the intellectual debt that Greece owes to Egypt and other African civilizations. Greece was undeniably influential, and its philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians made significant contributions to Western thought, but their achievements were built upon the intellectual foundations laid by the ancient Egyptians and other African civilizations. This recognition does not diminish Greek achievement, but elevates the true origins of Western knowledge. This movement to reclaim African intellectual history also highlights the importance of global collaboration and dialogue in shaping our understanding of the world. The development of knowledge is never a linear or isolated process. It is a global endeavor that transcends borders, cultures, and eras. The more we acknowledge the interwoven histories of different civilizations, the richer our understanding becomes. The impact of Egypt's intellectual legacy on Greece is just one example of this broader phenomenon, and there are countless other connections waiting to be discovered. For those of African descent, this recognition offers something deeply meaningful. It provides a sense of pride, empowerment, and validation. It reminds us that Africa has always been at the center of human intellectual history, not as a passive observer, but as a key player in shaping the world we live in today. This knowledge has the power to inspire new generations of thinkers, scholars, and leaders, encouraging them to explore the rich intellectual traditions of their ancestors and contribute to the ongoing conversation about the nature of knowledge, truth, and civilization. In the end, this process of rewriting history is about more than just acknowledging the past. It is about reshaping how we understand ourselves and the world around us. It is about recognizing the power of human intellect, regardless of where it originates, and understanding that we are all part of a larger interconnected story. The recognition of Africa's intellectual contributions is a necessary step in creating a more just, equitable, and inclusive world. One where all civilizations are given their due respect and credit as we continue to reassess our historical narratives. The role of education becomes central. Scholars, teachers, and educators must play a pivotal role in redefining how history is taught. The impact of African intellectual traditions on Western thought should no longer be relegated to the margins, but should be integrated into mainstream curricula. It's not just about adding a chapter to a history book. It's about fundamentally altering the way we understand the development of human knowledge. This shift would allow students of all backgrounds to see the interconnectedness of human civilizations and foster a deeper respect for diverse cultures and intellectual legacies. Incorporating African contributions into educational systems worldwide would also encourage a more holistic approach to learning. When students are exposed to the vastness of knowledge that stretches from ancient Egypt to Greece and beyond, they develop a broader perspective on the world. This expanded worldview can lead to more critical thinking, better problem-solving skills, and a deeper understanding of the challenges humanity faces today. The lessons from the past are not only relevant for understanding history, they are directly applicable to solving the problems of the present. Moreover, this re-examination of history can help dispel harmful stereotypes and misconceptions that have long been perpetuated about African people and their civilizations. By recognizing Egypt's intellectual contributions, we counter the false narrative that Africa was a dark continent devoid of civilization and intellectual achievement. Instead, we shine a light on the rich history of African thought and its profound impact on the course of human progress. This, in turn, challenges and undermines the centuries-old racism that has been entrenched in Western ideology and scholarship. It is crucial that this shift in historical understanding is accompanied by the celebration of African culture and intellectual tradition. This means honoring not just the ancient Egyptians, but also other African civilizations that have made significant contributions to human knowledge. From the Kingdom of Kush to Mali's universities of Timbuktu, the intellectual legacies of Africa are vast and varied, and they deserve to be recognized and celebrated on the world stage. Africa's role in the development of human civilization is too often minimized or erased. This must change if we are to build a more inclusive and truthful understanding of history. The impact of this shift extends far beyond academia. As African intellectual contributions are acknowledged and celebrated, there is the potential for a cultural renaissance, one that reclaims African heritage and reasserts it in the global dialogue. This can inspire new generations of Africans and people of African descent to embrace their history, take pride in their heritage, and continue the intellectual work of their ancestors. There is an urgency in this. If we do not recognize and value the achievements of those who came before us, we risk repeating the errors of history and allowing the erasure of Africa's intellectual contributions to continue in the broader global context. Recognizing the intellectual debt that the West owes to Africa also has the potential to reshape international relations. It challenges the notion of a one-way flow of knowledge where Western ideas are seen as the pinnacle of human thought, and Africa is viewed as a passive recipient. Instead, it encourages a more equitable exchange of ideas and values, one where all cultures contribute to the collective advancement of humanity. This would be a profound shift in how we perceive the world and the potential of all civilizations. The path to achieving this more inclusive view of history is not an easy one. It requires confronting deeply held beliefs, challenging institutionalized narratives, and addressing the lingering effects of colonialism. But it is a path that must be taken if we are to create a world that truly honors the contributions of all peoples. The first step is acknowledging the truth that the roots of Western philosophy, science, and medicine are intertwined with the intellectual traditions of Africa. From this acknowledgement, we can begin to build a more inclusive and accurate history, one that reflects the richness and diversity of human civilization. As we move forward, it is essential to remember that this process is not about diminishing the contributions of Greece, Rome, or any other civilization. It is about understanding that knowledge does not emerge from a vacuum. Ideas, philosophies, and innovations are the result of centuries of exchange, collaboration, and accumulation. The more we recognize the contributions of other cultures, the richer our understanding of the world becomes. It is time for the world to recognize the foundational role that Egypt and other African civilizations played in shaping the course of human thought. This is not a challenge to Greek achievements, but a recognition of the intellectual debt owed to Africa. By recognizing Egypt's contribution, we do not diminish the brilliance of Greek thinkers. We simply place their work in its rightful context. We acknowledge the debt that Greece and the Western world owe to Africa and begin to tell a more honest and complete story of human history. In this new narrative, Egypt's intellectual legacy will no longer be relegated to the shadows. It will be recognized as the foundation of Western philosophy, science, and medicine. And its contribution to human progress will be celebrated for generations to come. And in doing so, we will not only honor the past, but also pave the way for a more inclusive and equitable future, one where the contributions of all civilizations are acknowledged and celebrated. As we reflect on the monumental intellectual legacy of Egypt, it is important to understand that this shift in perspective is not just about correcting historical inaccuracies. It's about reimagining the future, a future where the achievements of Africa and particularly Egypt are woven into the fabric of global intellectual history. This reimagining has the potential to create a world that values the contributions of all civilizations, encouraging a spirit of collaboration rather than competition. By recognizing Egypt as the intellectual wellspring of Western thought, we can foster a global community where knowledge is shared freely and celebrated without hierarchy. One of the most profound implications of this shift is how it can transform the educational landscape worldwide. By teaching students not just the achievements of the Greeks, but also the foundational role that Egypt played, we give them the tools to think critically about the way history is constructed. We teach them that knowledge is not born in isolation, but rather evolves through a dynamic, interconnected process. This understanding has the power to foster a deeper appreciation for the contributions of all cultures, allowing students to see themselves as part of a larger global story of intellectual and cultural exchange. Moreover, by placing Egyptian intellectual achievements front and center in our historical narratives, we can start to undo the cultural erasure that has marginalized African contributions for centuries. The implications of this are vast, touching everything from the way we understand race and identity to how we approach global collaboration. When we recognize the profound impact that Egypt's intellectual heritage had on the development of Western thought, we begin to dismantle the outdated and harmful narratives that have reinforced divisions and stereotypes for centuries. This recognition also has the potential to reshape how we view modern African intellectuals. By understanding the deep ancient roots of African thought, we create a more supportive environment for African scholars, thinkers, and artists. These individuals can draw from the rich intellectual traditions of their ancestors and bring that wisdom into contemporary discussions, advancing the world's knowledge in ways that are currently underappreciated. When we acknowledge the brilliance of Africa's past, we open the door to recognizing the contributions of African intellectuals in the present and future. The circle of knowledge becomes complete with African contributions no longer left on the sidelines, but celebrated as essential to the ongoing story of human progress. This process also has the power to challenge the foundations of global power structures that have historically marginalized African knowledge and culture. It is not merely an intellectual challenge. It is a cultural and political one. By recognizing Africa's intellectual legacy, we confront the long-standing dominance of Western thought, which has been used to justify colonialism, exploitation, and the systematic silencing of non-European voices. The acknowledgement of Egypt's influence on Western civilization is therefore not just an academic exercise. It is a powerful political statement that redeefs the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. In this light, the truth of Egypt's intellectual legacy becomes a tool for justice. It provides a platform for African voices to be heard, for African cultures to be valued, and for African knowledge to be integrated into the global conversation on equal footing. This is not about taking away from Western thought. It is about restoring balance to the intellectual history of the world, ensuring that all contributions are acknowledged and respected. The intellectual debt that the West owes to Africa is not just a historical fact. It is a living truth that can shape our global future in profound ways. In a world increasingly connected by technology and global networks, it is crucial to recognize the power of shared knowledge and collective learning. As we continue to build a more interconnected world, we must remember that no civilization exists in isolation. Knowledge and culture have always flowed freely across borders, influencing and enriching one another. The more we understand and respect this shared history, the better equipped we will be to tackle the challenges of the modern world, whether they be environmental, political, or social. The recognition of Egypt's intellectual contributions to the West is a critical first step in this process, allowing us to build a more inclusive, collaborative future. In the end, the story of Egypt and its intellectual contributions is not just about correcting the historical record. It is about affirming the universality of knowledge. It is about recognizing that the wisdom of the past belongs to all of humanity, and that by acknowledging the roots of Western thought in Africa, we not only honor the past, but also pave the way for a more equitable and enlightened future. This is the legacy of Egypt, a legacy that continues to inspire and inform the development of human knowledge. The story of Egypt's contributions to Western thought is not over. It is ongoing, and it is time that the world fully recognizes and embraces the depth and breadth of this incredible intellectual tradition. As we close this chapter of intellectual history, it's essential to remember that the story of Egypt's contributions to Western philosophy and science is not just a historical fact. It is a dynamic force that continues to shape the present and future. In understanding Egypt's intellectual heritage, we are not just uncovering the past. We are rediscovering a powerful source of knowledge and wisdom that can guide us in navigating the complexities of the modern world. The ideas developed in Egypt's temples, the profound insights into the nature of reality, the cosmos, and human existence remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. Egypt's legacy is not a relic of the past. It is a living, breathing tradition that continues to resonate across time and geography. In the fields of mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and science, Egyptian knowledge laid the groundwork for many of the discoveries that followed. But its influence extends far beyond these disciplines, touching the very core of human understanding, our sense of who we are and how we relate to the universe. The ancient Egyptians understood the interconnectedness of all things, how the natural world, the divine, and human thought were deeply intertwined. This holistic view of knowledge can offer invaluable insights as we confront the challenges facing the world today. Moreover, by recognizing the intellectual contributions of Africa and Egypt, we not only enrich our understanding of history, but also make a bold statement about the future we are collectively building. It is a statement about the importance of inclusivity, of acknowledging the full range of human experience and wisdom. It is a call to expand the boundaries of what we consider to be knowledge, and to recognize that intellectual achievement is not confined to any one culture or civilization, but is a global and interconnected process. In embracing Egypt's role in shaping the foundations of Western thought, we reclaim the narrative of intellectual progress as a shared collective journey, rather than one determined by a single group or region. This is not about diminishing the achievements of Western civilization, but about placing them in their proper context. It is about recognizing that knowledge is not owned by any one culture or society, but is a treasure that has been passed down through generations and across continents. It is a recognition that Egypt was not merely a backdrop to Western history, but a critical player in the development of the ideas that would later define modern thought. The true story of Western philosophy is not one of isolated genius, but of shared knowledge, cultural exchange, and the blending of diverse intellectual traditions. The philosophers of ancient Greece may have systematized and articulated ideas that had been passed down from Egypt and other civilizations. But their work would have been impossible without the intellectual foundation laid by cultures like Egypt, whose thinkers had already begun to explore the fundamental questions of existence, morality, and the cosmos long before their Greek counterparts. In the end, this recognition of Egypt's intellectual legacy is about more than just history. It is about creating a future where the contributions of all cultures are celebrated and where knowledge is truly universal. It is about building a world where intellectual achievement is not divided along racial or geographical lines, but is seen as a shared human endeavor driven by curiosity, innovation, and the pursuit of truth. As we move forward, let us remember that the story of Egypt's contributions to Western philosophy is not just a story of the past, but one that continues to unfold. It is a story of intellectual exchange, of cultural collaboration, and of the timeless pursuit of knowledge. It is a story that deserves to be told in its full richness and complexity without omission or distortion. And it is a story that, if fully embraced, has the power to transform our understanding of the world and our place in it. The true origin of Western philosophy is not confined to Athens or Rome. It is deeply rooted in the house of life along the banks of the Nile, in the temples, scrolls, and intellectual traditions of ancient Egypt. It is a legacy that belongs to all of humanity, and it is time the world acknowledges it fully and without hesitation.